Walking through the winding lanes of old European towns, you might pass houses that have stood since the Middle Ages. It's incredible to realize that some of these buildings have outlasted wars, fires, storms, and centuries of daily life, all without modern tools or technology. To understand how medieval builders managed to create such enduring structures, we first have to look at the social classes who lived in them. Medieval life was built on a steep social pyramid, with each tier supporting the next. At the very top were kings and queens, enjoying lives of privilege while making big decisions about taxes, battles, and laws. These rulers were born into power, inheriting their thrones like winning tickets in history's least fair lottery. Beneath them were the nobles, wealthy landowners who spent much of their time running estates, throwing lavish banquets, and occasionally riding into war beside their monarchs, though most probably preferred the feasting. The middle class offered more variety. Merchants sold goods in crowded markets, craftsmen turned raw materials into prized items, and guildmasters ran trade organizations that combined schools, unions, and quality control boards. They weren't as rich as nobles, but they lived comfortably enough to eat well, and sometimes owned luxuries, like a second pair of shoes, a genuine status symbol in their world. Below them sat the peasants, making up nearly 90% of society. These laborers fueled the system, farming the land from sunrise to sunset. Some were free to move and find work, while others were serfs, tied permanently to their lord's land, working under conditions that made modern jobs look like paradise. Each class had roles that kept the system stable. Nobles and royalty promised protection, though often seemed more concerned about guarding their cellars than their people. They also acted as judges, handling disputes with all the power of a medieval courtroom drama. The middle class kept trade alive, forming guilds to regulate skills and apprenticeships. A boy training as a blacksmith, for instance, might spend years learning how not to set himself on fire before earning the right to open his own shop. Meanwhile, peasants did the exhausting work of raising crops and animals, paying taxes in food and labor, keeping nobles and castles supplied. Religion shaped the structure too. The church straddled every layer of society. Clergy offered education, mostly to wealthy boys, helped the poor when not busy building towering cathedrals, and worked hard to keep morality in line. Climbing the social ladder was nearly impossible. Most people died in the same class they were born into, but a few clever ones rose higher through education, especially by joining the church or mastering a trade. It was the medieval version of rags to slightly better rags. Holding everything together was feudalism, a system built on the exchange of protection for work and goods. Not fair, but remarkably durable. This hierarchy didn't just shape lives. It molded the very layout of medieval cities. Think of them as layered cakes of status, only with cramped alleys instead of frosting. Towns grew outward in circles, placing the most powerful buildings at the heart. Usually this meant a massive cathedral pointing heavenward, or a fortress reminding everyone who controlled the land, sometimes both, to really drive the message home. Around these centers clustered the wealthiest merchants and craftsmen, who wanted proximity to influence and protection, but not the danger of being first to face an enemy siege. The cities themselves were encircled by walls, the ultimate medieval security system. Some stood 30 feet tall and 12 feet thick, with 2 to 8 guarded gates that locked tight at night. Show up late, and you'd face stern guards instead of a warm bed. Inside, middle-class districts were a patchwork of timber-framed homes, packed together in noisy, smelly clusters. Trades often dictated the streets. Tanner Lane reeking of hides, Baker Street tempting everyone with fresh bread, or the Smithy Quarter where the sound of hammering never stopped. These districts resembled shopping centers, except plagued by constant fire risk and outbreaks of disease. As you approached the outer walls, conditions worsened. The poorest residents lived in flimsy wooden huts pressed against the defenses. These neighborhoods were so cramped that neighbors could reach across and shake hands through their windows. Most avoided doing that, though especially when plague swept through. The urban design of the Middle Ages captured social order in stone and timber, ensuring that hierarchy shaped not just daily life, but the very streets people walked. Medieval city streets weren't just places to walk. They were buzzing, chaotic, multi-purpose spaces. Markets spilled into every corner, animals wandered freely and left behind reminders of their presence, and apprentices worked in front of their master shops. The soundscape was relentless carpenters hammering, merchants hawking, lawyers arguing, and town criers shouting out royal announcements, sometimes down to what the king had for breakfast. One of the most striking things about medieval city planning is how little planning there actually was. Streets developed organically wherever people walked, which explains why old European towns today resemble tangled spaghetti on a map. The only exceptions were leftover Roman roads, straight, orderly, and sticking out like rulers dropped on a messy desk. Water access shaped daily life. Wells and fountains stood at key points, doubling as gathering spots where locals swapped gossip or grumbled about taxes, proving that some habits never change. Rivers running through cities were blessings for trade and laundry, but curses when they flooded or carried upstream waste into town. City layouts also reflected defense strategies. Wide roads often circled the center, designed so guards could rush quickly to defend the walls during sieges. Those same streets hosted festivals and parades, showing that medieval planners, whether intentionally or not, built for both security and celebration. While streets reflected defense and activity, individual homes revealed ingenuity and economics, especially in the rising merchant class. Middle-class houses might horrify a modern building inspector, but their design was clever for the time. Built with timber framing massive oak beams, slotted like a puzzle, and filled with wattle and daub, sticks, mud, and yes, animal manure, they were durable and relatively affordable. One typically cost 2 or 3 years of a craftsman's wages, roughly equal to 1,500 days' worth of bread. Shops usually occupied the ground floor, opening directly onto the street, with a kitchen hearth behind that doubled as the family's heat source. Smoke drifted upward through holes in the roof, turning entire houses into accidental smokehouses. Clothing constantly smelled of barbecue, but at least the family kept warm. Upper levels held the living quarters, usually one large room per floor, divided by screens or hanging cloths. Privacy was minimal. Families, servants, and apprentices often all slept together on raised straw beds, which wealthier households replaced yearly, while poorer ones rarely did. People often slept sitting upright, partly from superstition that lying flat attracted death, but also likely to avoid choking in smoke-filled rooms. Every inch of space was used for storage. Cupboards and chests tucked into walls held tools, linens, or valuables. Windows were covered not with glass far too expensive, but with oiled parchment or thin slices of horn, which let in hazy light while blocking most of the rain and only some of the wind. Medieval families grew used to the chill. A clever design feature was the jetted upper stories, each one jutting about 2 feet farther than the floor below. This gave more living space without increasing ground floor area, important since taxes were calculated on street-level size. The overhangs also sheltered pedestrians and protected lower walls from rain, though streets lined with them felt like tunnels closing in overhead. Inside, furniture was sparse and multifunctional. Folding tables hung from walls, chests doubled as benches, and beds were repurposed as seating during the day. The cooking pot was often the priciest item in the houseworth, as much as a cow, and so valuable it was listed in family wills. These homes weren't just residences. They were assets, often passed down through generations. Families sometimes rented out extra rooms or floors, creating a medieval version of apartments. Many such houses survive in places like Strasbourg, France, and York, England, often leaning precariously, but still standing. The builders of these homes were master craftsmen who had spent years perfecting their skills. Constructing a house was like managing a complex group project, except instead of charts and slides, the work involved hauling beams and carving joints. The master carpenter was more than a builder. He was architect, engineer, and foreman combined. Apprentices trained for 7 years or more, mastering everything from simple joints to calculating structural loads, even if they didn't call it mathematics. The process began with sourcing timber. Oak trees chosen for the main beams had to be at least 60 years old, harvested in the winter when sap levels were lowest. Cutting and transporting these giants was only the beginning of the long journey to raising a house that could last centuries. The timbers couldn't go straight from the forest into a frame. They had to be shaped, stacked, and left to season for at least a year before use. Builders knew unseasoned wood bent and warped, which spelled disaster for a structure meant to last generations. While the beams dried, other crews prepared the foundations and gathered materials like stone for the house base. No one wanted their carefully crafted frame sitting on damp soil, rotting away before its owners even moved in. Each worker on the project had a defined role. Sawyers, who reduced the giant tree trunks into usable lengths, worked in pairs on two-handled saws, with one unfortunate man standing below in a saw pit, covered in falling dust and chips. Carpenters then carved and notched the beams, using distinctive marks as a code to match every piece. It was a numbering system so clever, it still shows up on surviving timbers today, essentially a medieval IKEA manual, though one with no Allen wrenches, more splinters, and quite a lot of muttered curses. The time it took to complete a house varied, but most middle-class builds stretched from 3 to 6 months. First, the wooden skeleton was carefully laid out on the ground like an enormous puzzle. Then came the dramatic part, raising the frame. With ropes, pulleys, and sheer muscle, sections were hauled upright, steadied, and locked into place. Entire neighborhoods often gathered to help, turning construction into a community spectacle, something like a barn raising, only with more spilled ale and zero safety standards. Transporting materials posed its own challenges. Local stone was always preferred, but if the area lacked good quarries, blocks had to be carted in over miles of rough roads or floated downstream. Clay for wattle and daub came from nearby pits, and lime for mortar had to be burned in kilns outside the city walls. These kilns stank so badly that regulations forced them to sit downwind of town. Straw, reeds, and animal hair provided the binding for daub, making use of whatever could be scavenged. Even the fleece of your neighbor's sheep might quietly end up plastered into your walls. The methods were simple but ingenious. Instead of metal rulers or laser levels, carpenters relied on ropes knotted to exact lengths, plumb bobs for vertical accuracy, and carved wooden patterns for joints. Their tools were recognizable even today. Chisels, axes, saws, mallets, and adzes, all lovingly sharpened and repaired. A craftsman's toolkit could last a lifetime and was often handed down like a family treasure. Perhaps the most ingenious trick of all was using green, unseasoned wood for select joints. As the timber dried, it shrank and pulled the pieces tighter together, locking the frame like nature's own clamp. As houses aged, they groaned and shifted, producing eerie sounds that gave rise to ghost stories. In truth, the creaks were physics, not phantoms. The skill was so precise that many of these timber houses still stand, their joints holding firm after centuries of weather and war. Yet for all their strength, these homes were modest compared to the towering residences of nobles and kings. Wealthy families built on an entirely different scale, with stone as their material of choice. Their great halls and towers soared upward, sometimes 80 feet tall, with walls 8 or 10 feet thick. These fortresses were not only symbols of wealth, but practical shields against attack, fire, and time itself. The technique used was rubble-filled masonry, carefully cut stones forming the outer layers. With a dense core of rubble and mortar, sandwiched between. The result was a stone wall thick enough to stop arrows, catapults, and even early cannons. Naturally, such power came at enormous cost. A single manor house could consume the wages of 850 years' worth of skilled labor. And that was before luxuries were added. Glass panes costing the equivalent of farmland, rich tapestries to block the cold, and glittering silver plate for banquets large enough to feed armies. Running these vast estates required an army of people. A typical noble household employed 30 to 50 staff, from cooks and cleaners to highly specialized roles. There was the keeper of the wardrobe, acting as a personal stylist, the master of the horse, who oversaw stables and travel, and food tasters, whose job was as risky as any soldier's. The chain of command in these houses was so complex, it resembled a miniature government. Inside, the architecture was designed to awe. The great hall dominated the home, serving as dining chamber, courtroom, and ceremonial space. Its high ceilings allowed smoke to rise from the hearth before drifting out through vents. In wealthier residences, chimneys revolutionized heating, channeling smoke outside rather than choking guests. Windows, though narrow, provided both light and defensive advantage, and deep stone walls often housed window seats, where noblewomen embroidered while watching the horizon for friend or foe. Practicality played a part too. Vast cellars stored wine, grain, and preserved meats, while locked strong rooms guarded treasures. Kitchens were frequently set in separate wings or outbuildings to minimize the danger of fire. Some estates even experimented with primitive plumbing, collecting rainwater into cisterns and channeling it through lead pipes. Ironically, the peasants drawing water from a simple well may have been healthier. The building techniques guaranteed durability. Foundations were dug down to bedrock. Stones were carved to fit so precisely that many walls remained solid without modern cement. Beams for the roofs came from oak trees' centuries-old timber so massive that many are still holding firm today, more than half a millennium later. Some of those oaks had started growing while the Roman Empire still ruled. So while the common folk lived in timber-framed homes that creaked, smoked, and smelled of livestock, the nobility inhabited stone fortresses that symbolized permanence and power. Together, they reveal the astonishing range of medieval building skill, from the practical genius of the craftsman to the monumental ambition of kings. The gap between noble estates and peasant huts highlighted medieval inequality better than anything else. While lords debated which imported tapestry best matched their banquet hall, peasants simply prayed their thatched roofs wouldn't cave in under the next heavy storm. A typical peasant dwelling was shockingly small, around 12 by 24 feet. That's less space than many modern living rooms, yet entire families crammed into it alongside their livestock. The animals weren't there out of affection, but necessity, since their body heat helped warm the room in winter. Of course, that meant sharing the home with smells that no amount of rushes could disguise. Building these huts was fast and improvised. The most common style was cruck construction, where two curved timbers formed the central A-frame. These weren't the carefully selected oaks reserved for merchants' houses, but whatever timber peasants could scavenge, or were permitted to cut from the lord's woods. Walls were filled in with wattle and daub, but unlike the tidy versions used in towns, peasant mixes included straw, soil, manure, and even animal bones. It was medieval recycling at its most creative. Roofs were usually thatched with straw, though quality materials were expensive. A well-done thatch might last 5 years, but most peasants had to patch theirs every year with whatever grew nearby: rushes, reeds, heather, or even chunks of turf. In tough times, huts sprouted grassy green rooftops that looked almost like early eco-housing, though it was more desperation than design. The floor was nothing more than packed earth, sometimes scattered with straw or rushes to soften it. Over the years, constant trampling wore the surface lower and lower until many floors sank below ground level. Archaeologists call these subterranean features, but in practice, they were just muddy pits filled with water whenever it rained. Some families dug drainage ditches around the house, but these often doubled as open sewers, leaving the yard smelling like a medieval fairground latrine. Inside, furniture was sparse and crude. A table was essential, maybe a rough bench or two, but little else. Beds were rare luxuries, so most people slept on straw pallets laid directly on the floor. The hearth was the centerpiece, just a fire pit in the middle of the room with smoke drifting upward through a roof hole. This meant homes were either unbearably smoky or bitterly cold, hardly ideal, but those were the options. These modest houses had a short lifespan, usually 20 to 30 years, before collapsing or being rebuilt from scratch. That sounds brief, but considering they could be thrown together in about 2 weeks using free local materials, it wasn't a terrible bargain. In many ways, they weren't so much demolished as recycled back into the earth, more like oversized compost heaps than permanent buildings. Today, nearly all of those simple huts have vanished, but the grand castles and sturdy merchant homes still stand, enduring testaments to the skill and resources of those who built them. From the poorest peasant shack to the most extravagant fortress, every dwelling reflected its owner's place in the medieval world. Together, they tell a story of survival, ingenuity, and humanity's endless drive to create shelter, no matter the resources at hand.